Late Night is a talk show with published authors, writers, and content creators discussing both the creative and technical sides of writing, as well as the industry surrounding it, from novels to screenplays to comics and more. And now, here's your host, author Travis I. Sivart.
Welcome to Write Night. We'll get to the topic and discussion in just a moment. For those listening to the podcast, we record the podcast on our live stream at twitch.tv/Travis Tavern Talk, and we have a live interactive chat audience. You might hear the sound of the bell ding, and that means I want to interrupt somebody to read a comment or question. For those on the live stream, we won't read off everything you put in chat, but we'll try to get to the most relevant, the most amusing, or some combination of the both. Now, while we introduce ourselves, go and let us know what you're reading, writing, or creating tonight. Okay, and I'll introduce myself, Travis I. Sivart, and in the fantasy realm, we have a couple series, the Portal series and the Downfall series that I both wrote. It could be found on Amazon. And now, let's start with Aaron. Why don't you introduce yourself next, and when you're done, pass it over to Robert, please.
I don't wanna. Hi, I'm Aaron Kennedy, author of Persona Non Grata, the Ships of Power series. Currently working on Icarus Black, set in the same universe. Imagine Harry Potter in space. Available on Amazon. Woo-hoo.
Imagine if Harry Potter was in space, he'd explode or implode.
One of the two. Freeze to death, most likely. Been a technical writer for 25 some odd years. Master of many trades. Currently working from home this week. To you, Turk.
Hey, I am Robert Turk, author and game designer. I have published 5 role-playing games, working on a 6th one called Gablonia, and about that many books, if not more, poetry, short stories, and most recently a middle grade novel, Persnickety Jones and the Pirates of Undertow.
And is that out yet, or when does that come out?
No, that is out. That's been out for over a year now. Before the pandemic, I was taking it to schools and doing library visits and teaching kids about writing. Oh, and you can find my stuff at wicked-clever.com on the internet.
Very good. And let me read off a few comments. Raven says, Harry is magical. Could cast a protective bubble. And then Sodaru, thank you very much for that host. I assume there's probably a raid along with it, but that did not trigger. But thank you very much, and here's to you for that. Glad to have you here on Right Night. Mm-hmm. So tonight's topic is going to be fantasy length. And as I said, we're not heading towards the adult side of things with this one, but to discuss the length of fantasy novels, because some people really love that epic fantasy where one novel 400 pages long isn't nearly enough. They need another 13 just like it to go with it. Or trilogies, or, quintilogies. I think there's a better word for that, but I don't know it right now. And or standalone fantasy one-offs. So we're going to talk about just really across the board everything, and probably a half dozen other things, knowing how this crew gets. So.
Yes,
Aaron.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay. So. I am a firm believer that make novels the length they need to be. You don't necessarily need to have it crazy long, and fantasy is one of those ones that tends to be longer by default. Everybody wants the epic, is kind of the perception, or it's the standard allows it to be longer. You've got your Game of Thrones, which are phone books. You've got your Wheel of Time, which is 13 novels. I don't know. I gave up after book 10. You got your Name of the Wind, which is again a phone book, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but tell the story, and you don't write it for the fans. You write it to tell a story. But if it takes a decade to tell the story, you're doing yourself and your fans a disservice um, because sooner or later it's a product. Um, Harry Potter. Harry Potter does a great thing, and that is in the fantasy genre. Yes, it's young adult, but the first one's only a couple hundred pages. It's out. It's got a completed story, and it's done. The second one, same deal, done, and so on and so forth. It's not until later on that you get this epic fantasy series.
I think that's more of a scope. I mean, because you can,
Right.
for the most part, read any one of the books and get a complete story in each one of those books.
Mhm.
And before we go much
Absolutely.
further, and it slips out here, Raven says, I'm happy with about 80K to 120K words. And Ghostbite says, personally, I aim for 100,000K and then to cut it down. I agree with what
Yeah.
you say there, Aaron, about just write your story. Now, I know yourself with your current series, you're like, 9 books, it's going to be this, here's the arcs. So, some people, instead of writing to the story, write the story to their goal. So, that's constructing it around this notion of the word count I want, the story length, the how many books to complete this. So, Robert, do you think there's a right way or a wrong way to do this?
I don't think there's a right way or a wrong way. What I see, because I am an avid reader, as well as being an author, I read a lot. Sometimes 4 or 5 novels in a week. On a really boring slow week, I'll read 4 or 5 novels.
I was
when
just
got
wondering,
nothing
when the
else.
hell do you have time for all that?
I don't sleep very well, so I'll
Okay.
stay up till 2 or 3 in the morning if a book catches me. I like a book that moves quickly, that tells its story, and I think the trap that a lot of fantasy authors, especially fantasy authors from the 90s and 2000s, fall into is Tolkienitis. That they think they have to write these epic worlds like Tolkien wrote and throw everything at it, all the words, and build up all of the description. And I find that that's usually not needed. I personally think Tolkien desperately needed an editor come in and chop away paragraphs in some instances. Aaron.
I'm gonna friggin' counterpoint that. The Hobbit has 95,000 words in it.
Seems like a great length.
Yes.
Yeah,
Now-
but the Hobbit story moves. And I'm not saying Tolkien wrote bad stories. He wrote great stories. But we all know he was a historian and an academic, and he does delve into some wordiness and some descriptions, and that I mean, personally, when I read him the first time, I did this naturally. If I started to get bored in a paragraph, I skip to the next paragraph. And I do that in anything I'm reading. If I'm getting bored, no matter how much I like the book, all right, yeah, skim this paragraph and move on to the next one. But I think too many fantasy authors, and I'm going to call out George R.R. Martin. I'm going to call out The Wheel of Time, Robert Jordan, trying to write like Tolkien, and their books get longer and wordier and wordier. And personally, me as a reader, I don't need that. Now, I was going into this thinking, my perfect fantasy story that moves quickly, has great characters. I think back to Dragonlance,
Mhm.
Dragons of Autumn Twilight, and I just looked up the word count, and it's 174,000 words in that first book. Didn't realize that. That's a beast of a book. So I think you're right on your point of tell your story. And I find that the best story is one that you don't say any more than absolutely needs to be said.
No.
Before
I
you
wanna just-
respond, let me read some comments, if I may, please. Because the Tolkien thing is going back and forth in chat here, and I feel it's pertinent to what we're going into here. Ghost says, I think a shorter goal helps with pacing too, and not let myself get too egotistical, like the Tolkien thing he's talking about. Robert, in this case, I believe. And Sadaru says, to be fair, Tolkien was not the first to do this. Tolkien was one of many. Raven says modern fiction isn't as wordy. There's less focus on being poetic and crafting beautiful prose.
I like beautiful prose. I really do. What I don't need is the history of the 20 kings in succession that bring us to modern day in your city, and the all the different streets and all the different neighborhoods. It's I would prefer more of a Discworld fantasy that you paint with vagueness, and you let the reader fill in the blanks.
No, see, that's a great point. We've got the feel of things, and then we've got the reality of things. Okay, so we take a look at the three main novels inside of Tolkien. Okay, 150,000 words, 190,000 words, 140,000 words. Okay, the shortest of Jordan's books is in the 300s.
Right.
Okay, so they're not even in the same league. Because they started breaking them down in halves to resell them to the kids. Go ahead, Travis.
This is two very different types of fantasy. When you're talking about epic fantasy, this is where you're getting those 130 plus word books, up to 300,000. And also, you've got to be at a certain level of success to be able to print a book with that kind of binding, because it pops the level of expense. I'm also.
You got to be at a certain level of success to have a publisher print that book.
Right.
Like, as an ebook, you can be as wordy as you want.
It's true.
And you can pump out your 60,000 word whatever. I'm not going to read it.
But also with epic fantasy versus, I guess, regular fantasy, or maybe swords and sorcery, the faster paced Discworld type stuff. Raven's Muse had said modern fiction standards are to look at each scene, and if it's not propelling the plot or developing a character, your editor will cut it. When you look at epic fantasy, it is more of painting the whole landscape with words. It gives you a deeper, broader palette to work with, or canvas to work with, not palette, my phone. But yeah, it's two different things. And if you're going to write epic fantasy, you want that next thing coming up, and you want it to look like there's just a lot on the horizon. Where if you're writing a single book, you want to make that quick, tight, and neat.
Yes, I hear what you're saying, but also I think there's a trap there that you don't want your reader, even if you're an author writing epic fantasy and thinking, I want to paint this picture with my words, I want to paint this prose, and I want them to feel like this is huge. You don't want your reader to get a sentence or two into your paragraph and say this is boring and skip it, because that's wasted time and effort. Even in epic fantasy, I think there can be a paring down.
Oh, I'll agree with you that, because with Robert Jordan, who I've read them all, and George R. R. Martin, read them all, there's a point where I'm just like, oh my God, where's your editor?
Right.
Now, let me ask you this question, okay? And there is no right answer or wrong answer, and mostly rhetorical here. Are you a creative or are you a business person?
Who are you asking?
Both of you guys. Okay, because when it boils down to it, we've got Sir Terry here, okay? This book is one of his later novels, and it's about 320 pages.
Yeah.
But he put out 3 to 4 a year for 20 some odd years.
I don't know that they came that fast. I would say maybe he got out 2 a year.
Sorry, about 2 a year at the beginning, and then he would get 1, and then it got up to 2, and then it would get to towards the end. He had already got kind of the build up there. He was pumping them out though. He produced books.
He did, but he didn't produce books in the same way that I just forgot his name. The Xanth guy.
Piers Anthony.
Who was that?
Oh, Piers Anthony?
Piers Anthony did write 3 books a year, and published 3 books a year, and that was his thing. Because because and actually some of the best things about Piers Anthony's books is reading his basically mini book at the end of his books on the process that he went through for writing this book. I've actually found that better in many cases than the book he wrote. But how he would write during the winter at his typewriter, and then he would polish over the summer. So he would line them up, and he would do 3 over the winter or 2 some winters, and then crank them out. But I think when you compare quality there, Piers Anthony was definitely a cranking out books because he was getting paid to crank out books, and Terry Pratchett, who was also getting paid to write books, clearly, he had a message. He had, and maybe it was just his natural wit, but he wasn't putting out books faster than his message. He wasn't putting out books faster than his ideas, which I think Piers Anthony many times did put out books that were just because his publisher wanted him to put out a book that year.
If I may, Piers Anthony, I cut my teeth on Piers Anthony before I read Dragonlance or anything like that.
Sure.
And I still adore him, but that being said, I don't know if it would hold up if I read him again now. But here's what I'll say. I'd
say some of his stuff would, but not all of it.
The first 3 in any one of his series were good. He was writing a story at that point in time. But yeah, Xanth, and actually Xanth, I would say, even was good till Ogre, Book 5, or Nightmare, Book 6. But after that, Cruel Eye was okay, and after Cruel Eye, yeah, it just felt like he's collecting all the puns people mailed him and finding a place to stick him in this loosely threaded story. But
he found a formula.
And it worked for him. So
but I think so that was like his easy book, I think, of a year was his Xanth book. And then he was also writing the
Split Infinity, Bio of a Space Tyrant, Orn Ox Omnivore was one of his heavier, hard sci-fi.
What was the one about the wielding a green sword or wearing
that?
So,
by the way, I have a rant about that series. That's the Incarnations of Immortality, and the first books first 5 books are excellent, and I'll still stand by the first 3 are better than 4 and 5.
Yes, they
Book 6, he took the Anne Rice path and rewrote his other books from a different point of view, and then gave you 30% new content at the end. And Book 7, and apparently,
Where I honestly, now my wife is not a Piers Anthony, my wife is not a Terry Pratchett fan for most of his work. She likes the kids one that he did about the girl
Tiffany
witch,
Aching.
the Tiffany Aching, which started in Discworld and then kind of split off as its own series.
Well, it's the We Free Men, so it's off into the sides.
Yeah, it's off to the side. Because when I was reading Terry Pratchett, I gave her one of the books to try and read, and she's like, I can't read this. But I don't think Terry Pratchett ever made a bad book. Like, there's not one that I can look at and say, this wasn't up to his standards.
He got better read him in production order, and he gets better with every book.
Sure, I think that's the case of hopefully any author out there.
But the Tiffany Aching ones were at the end, so he really got his message across at the end, which is so he focused on that.
Yeah.
But I mean, I start looking at that one, and of the books that I've got on my shelf behind me, I've got Chris Paolini's The Brissinger series. I've got a couple of those. Both of those are twice as thick as my Pratchett's. And I'm just taking a quick gander over here. I've got Christopher Moore. He does...
Yep, I know Christopher Moore.
Yep, he did The Lamb and a couple others. They're
good comedy.
Modern fantasy. Very good comedy. But they're in the same vein as Pratchett. The ones my wife has got, the Jacqueline Carey's, they're twice the thickness. They're a lot of world building and things like that. And I get that you've got a world build. But
I'm not laughing at you. I really am not.
but it's one of those. Sometimes the world building and the naming and the things like that, those are the things that are going to kill you. I have to be able to pronounce the names, or I have to build up to the
Right.
point where I can pronounce the names.
Ooh, yep.
And it's tough. And that just adds length, and not, I don't want to say unnecessary length, but tedious length.
Yeah. We had a write night recently. Recorded it with John from Conquest Publishing about world building, and that's why I started laughing, because I honestly think most world building, like when an author says world building, that's the same thing to me as verbal masturbation. That's you're throwing words on the page that don't need to be there in most cases.
So I go back to Stan Lee. Why is everything Stan Lee did based in New York? Because he was already familiar with New York. The people were roughly familiar with New York. He didn't have to explain it. He said, "Oh,
Right.
these are the boroughs. This is where the things are taking place," and he could just kind of do things. All right, we're there. And how you react to the area was more important than the verbal masturbation of
Yeah.
the world building, or your world building transparently, which for Robert Asprin, and the Myth series, he does a great job of world building because his characters do it for you. He doesn't describe the world; his characters build the world around them.
Yes. I was just looking up. So Scott Lynch is a modern author. Wrote The Lies of Locke Lamora and the Gentleman Bastard series. His world building, you get it because the characters experience it.
Right.
There's no paragraph in there that talks about this is the way things are and this is why they are, or these are the races that are in this world, or these are the politics of this world, or the landscape of this world, or any of that. No, you get it as the story progresses, as you need it, because his characters experience it, or remember it and flash back and tell their story about when this happened or why that happened. I'm looking up the word count right now. But so for me, that is, and he's one of my favorite modern authors. That's the best way to tell your story, to get your story across, and without adding that extra length, without adding that epic fantasy to describe the world. Just let your characters experience it, and you will end up with a smoother book and usually a shorter book. But I'm gonna find out how many words is that, because I could be wrong again.
And Wordowin chimes in with, I think the amount/depth of world building also depends a lot on genre, and that's what we're comparing right now. Wordowin is, we're talking about fantasy specifically, but we've pointed out that there is kind of your standard fantasy, and then there's epic fantasy where they do paint the picture a lot more of your surroundings and the world building or whatever. Couple other comments here. Wordowin did say Glenn Cook is amazing at changing his writing style and voice from series to series. And earlier, John of Conquest Publishing had said, sometimes it's like bands. The next song sounds similar. Some series writers seem to fall into that groove. So,
I'm also going to point out Lies of Locke Lamora, 191,000 words. So again, I'm wrong on the length, but it doesn't feel long.
Well, no,
because the story moves.
Time slows or expands based on how things are. Tolkien feels long.
Feels long.
But compared to Jordan is long. Doesn't feel as long as Tolkien is.
Jordan always felt pretty long for me. I didn't finish the series because he felt too long.
Well, and the problem is, once you get 9 books in, it's really hard to. And now once you've been introduced to him, you get 5 or 6 books in. You're like, oh, okay, I pick up the next book. I pick up the next book, and then you caught up with him.
Yeah.
And then the fucker died.
Well, I mean, that happens.
only once.
Right. But I'm pointing this out. It's one of those, if you're going to write an epic fantasy series that
Don't
spans
die.
12 novels, maybe edit it down a little.
Yeah, and don't die before you're done.
No,
Right.
Robert
I'm looking at
Jordan.
you, G.R.R. Martin.
He's already done in TV. He's not making it to the end. Robert Jordan is another series that I very much enjoyed, but what I found is book 1 through 4, though each one got a little longer, they were good. They were still moving the story. When I got to book 5, I believe it's every odd book at that point in time. Feels like you could almost skip it, because he felt like he did one book where he moves the story, another book just of
Exposition.
right, where he's just going into all this extra stuff that I'm like, yeah, I don't actually care. Don't actually care. It's and I liked
Yeah,
him.
it's you had the three main characters doing their thing, and then you had all these side characters,
Which became
or the guys doing it and then the girls doing it. The guys doing
Right.
it, the girls doing it.
Now, I will say this: Brandon Sanderson is the one that took over from for the last 2.5 books, technically last 3, if I'm not mistaken, up to book 14. And Brandon Sanderson wrote a lot more concise for this series. You felt like everything was important.
Yeah.
Robert Jordan would do a 60-page prologue that I'm like, okay, I don't know what that was all about. And I get to the end of that book, and I'm like, I still don't know how the prologue fits into this. Why did I read that?
Well,
Right.
the very beginning, book 1, trying to figure out what the hell the dragon in the past was, didn't make any sense until you make it to book 2 or 3.
Right. Which some people love that. They're like, oh, look, it was foreshadowing so many books. Yeah, I get that. It's great. But, it, in my humble opinion, it needs to relate to the book I'm reading right now.
Right.
Now, I love
Um,
going back and finding out extra details that I didn't catch until I had read through a couple books. And then I'm like, oh, there is more. It's got layers. Awesome. What were you going to say, Robert?
Well, I was gonna say so because a couple people in the chat have commented about my series was gonna be 6 books, or I was gonna do 9 books, and then I said no, there's no point. When I released Persnickey Jones of the Pirates of Undertow and gave it to the local librarian in my kids' elementary school, who had kind of prompted me to get this book out and finish it, and so she was the first person that got to have the printed book, and she asked. She goes, is this a series? Is this a trilogy? Because you know that's really big in all literature, but especially in children's literature right now. And my answer was, it's a standalone story. And if the muse strikes me to write a second one, sure, I can write another story with these characters. But I never go into the idea of, and it actually baffles me that people do this, go in the idea of, I'm going to take 6 books to tell this story. And I know that's epic fantasy, and I don't write epic fantasy, but for me, it's like, I'm going to write and tell this story. And if this story then leads into the next story, and they grow together, there's something that links them, great. But I want to be able to pick up a book. Like, nothing pisses me off more than getting to the end of a book and it didn't finish. Like, the story didn't finish. It's... We got to go to book 2 to get the rest of the story.
Now, counterpoint to that, okay, and I'll go back to the Harry Potter, and I'm going to use Icarus Black, my series, on this one. I'm telling the story of a character's life, okay? And I've got various themes here, but each book is a story. It's a specific story, much like Star Wars is a specific story. At the end of episode 4, that story is done. At the end of episode 5, that story is done. Now, yes, we know there's a cliffhanger there. At the end of episode 6, that story is done, or at least that arc is done.
Right.
Now, we do not speak of the prequels, okay? But I built it along that kind of concept. I'm going to go, hey, I've got a 3-act play, and that's what I'm building. I'm building a 3-act play. And it's just, I've broken it down into individual acts within the act.
Sure, but if you actually went and watched a 3-act play and they stopped the play after Act 1 and said, okay, that's all you get this week, you're going to have to come back in a year to see Act 2, as an audience member, you'd be pissed off. Now, Shakespeare did this with his Henry the Whatever series. He wrote it as one big play, but it's produced in multiple parts. But usually when they produce it, it'll be, we're going to produce part 1 this day, and part 2 will be produced, well, like we'll do part 1 this week, we'll do part 2 next week and come back to it. So I get what you're saying about writing a book that here's Act 1 in this book, here's Act 2 in this book, here's Act 3 in this book. As a reader, that still pisses me off because I don't want to see just Act 1. I want to see the complete story.
Charles Dickens, Arthur Conan Doyle, friggin' all of our early 20th century writers produced it episodically. Buffy the Vampire Slayer was produced as an episodic. We got a monster of the week
Sure.
over the course of 13 or 26 episodes.
But that's
all I'm
show.
doing. I'm writing it like a television show.
Right.
All right. I'm not criticizing your work because I haven't read it.
Aaron, what he's saying, if it's left on a cliffhanger, if it's left with an unfinished
yeah.
story, you're saying you're finishing the story. I don't think you guys are actually disagreeing at all.
Yeah. I will say one of my other favorite authors, which I've just forgotten his name, but he wrote The Name of the Wind. I don't know if you'll
Patrick Rothfuss, yeah.
Yes, okay. That book, actually, I love the book, and I love the second book, but it's the same thing. It pisses me off when I get to the end of it. Actually, it starts to piss me off when I get about 50 pages from the end and realize there's no way he's finishing this story in 50 pages. And he does not finish the story in book 1. It's a great book, but he doesn't finish the story. He cuts back to the tavern and basically says, okay, and that's where we're going to stop for tonight. I'm going to bed. Bullshit. That's you didn't finish your damn story that you set out to write. And then we waited multiple years to get part 2, and we've waited twice that long and don't have part 3. It's kind of the same thing as the George R.R. Martin. People have been waiting and waiting and waiting for the last book. They're probably never going to get it. And I'm not saying, clearly he's a great author. Clearly he sells well. Me as an author, me as a reader, I don't appreciate that.
Understand. And some people do, and that's fine too. That's why you have different writers for different readers. It's, I myself love a book that finishes itself, but I've had some favorite authors that I've forgiven and pick up the next book, mostly because I pick it up at the end of after they wrote the whole series. Couple of comments here. Let's see here. Go says, I think at least for book 1 of a series, you should finish it in order to give an accurate representation of your series, like a pilot wraps itself up. For the next books, I can appreciate it when it's appropriate. And yeah, I think even Wheel of Time, book 1, can be a standalone novel. You know,
I think so.
With George R.R. Martin's Ice and Fire series, book 1, it can be a standalone novel. And that's how you do it. Now, once you get that and leaving some, you leave some threads unpulled, you leave some plot hooks deep in the meat of the story, but you finish your primary arc for that book. And some of these epic fantasy authors, they don't. I mean, they do for the first few books, probably why I found them satisfying in the first couple, but then eventually you're just like, this is just one huge, never-ending, rambling tale, and, yeah, it's, And then you have this huge gap, between books, or, while getting that other writer in there to finish the series, which Robert Jordan hired Brandon Sanderson before he died because he knew that was coming. And he actually handed him multiple books worth of notes and outlines and told him, this is how I want it to go. And I think we could all, anybody who enjoyed that series, go, oh, thank goodness. Because we actually get the end to the story, and yeah. Let's see here. I'm going to read Wordwin's comment, then we're going to flip back to this and maybe head towards final thoughts on fantasy length. Wordwin says, I'm pretty weird. Oh, wait, there's a lot more to that. I'm pretty weird. Skinwalker definitely ends abruptly, but I'm not going to publish it until I finish a rough draft for the next part. Wicked has a long-term plot, but it's also very episodic. It has a season story arc, so to speak. Yeah, and I think that's great. That's what Aaron is looking at doing with Icarus Black is, again, he referenced Star Wars, where you have a trilogy of trilogies, but each one is a different part of the life and a different arc through life, but each individual book is its own moment or episode in that life, etc. And you can break it down even further and go, the chapters are the same thing. You know, it's... Yeah. Okay, so gentlemen, with fantasy length, got any ideas to wrap this stuff up? Robert, you've been very passionate, shall we? I'm sorry, Aaron, you got stuff? Go ahead.
Yeah, tell the story. Don't fluff your story. That's yes, porn reference. But yeah, don't make the story longer than it needs to be. It's great to have a goal. Hey, we're looking at 80,000 for a novel. We're looking at 120,000. We're looking at 180. It doesn't have to be 300,000 because that's what Robert Jordan did. It doesn't have to be 400,000. It doesn't have to be this. You don't have to be able to kill somebody with your book. Remember, your editor charges you by the word, and if they're just going to cut it anyway, remember that.
Robert?
And not just your editor. Their pages cost money. The longer your book is, the more it costs to print that, if you're printing it physically. So I will preface this by saying I went into this episode thinking I really didn't like long epic fantasy and proved myself wrong looking up word counts of my favorite books. And I think exactly what Aaron said there. It's how you tell your story. I'm a firm believer that there should be nothing in your book that doesn't advance the story forward. You don't need to tell us about the 20 kings that came before unless each and every one of those kings is crucial to your story. You can simply say there were 20 kings before, or a long line, and move on. You don't have to tell us the history of your world. And definitely, when you're writing your first book, don't shoot for 600,000 words. Don't shoot for 300,000 words. Shoot much lower.
Okay.
Get it done and get it out there.
Okay. Very good. Let's wrap this up, and we will catch you guys on the next episode of Right Night. Say goodbye to everybody, guys.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Yeah, we'll take this away.
Before we go, I want to remind everyone that you can email us at rightnightshow@gmail.com. That's right with the W, night with an N, show@gmail.com. To let us know your thoughts on the show's topic, suggest other topics you'd like to hear us discuss, or just have a message read out on air to someone in your life. Thanks to everyone for supporting the show by downloading the podcast, sharing it on social media, grabbing some shirt stickers and mugs from bit.ly/tavern merch, or barware patches and hats from bit.ly/tavern merch too. It's bit.ly/tavern merch or tavern merch followed by the number 2. Thanks to everyone who joined us live at twitch.tv/Travis Tavern Talk, and everyone who supports the tavern by subscribing, posting, throwing bits, raids, and most of all, commenting.
Thank you for joining author Travis I. Sivart and the other writers, content creators, and all-around amazing people for our discussion here on Right. Join us again soon, and until you do, make sure you create with passion, enjoy the journey, and remember, every night can be right night.